has been a crucial ally to Russia. Ukraine has historical ties to Russia. Ukraine is on Russia's border. Ukraine is a national security interest to Russia. The United States has viewed Ukraine as potentially a way to weaken Russia. We go back to the neocons in the early 1990s, Scooter Libby, Stephen Hadley, Paul Wolfowitz, the architects of the US invasion of Iraq, understood and stated explicitly, according to Hadley, that if they can somehow wrest Ukraine away from Russia, it will prevent Russia from ever being a superpower again. This is 1991. This is when the Soviet Union was falling apart. We had certain neocons who were planning global strategy at that point. They were beginning to fantasize about Ukraine. This is stated even more explicitly by Zbigniew Brzezinski in his important 1997 book, The Grand Chessboard. Let me read a little bit from Brzezinski. He says, Ukraine is a geopolitical pivot because its very existence as an independent country helped to transform Russia. Without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be a Eurasian empire. However, if Moscow regains control over Ukraine, with its 52 million people and major resources, as well as access to the Black Sea, Russia automatically again regains the wherewithal to become a powerful imperial state spanning Europe and Asia. They knew this from the beginning, that Russia was crucial. That Ukraine is crucial to Russia's reemergence after 1991 as a major player. You have to put this together with the overall planning. In 1993, they come up with their defense planning guidance. And that says that the United States is the world's unipolar power and should not allow anybody anywhere to emerge that can threaten American interests, even in any specific region of the world. So it was part of their strategy from the beginning to weaken Russia. And they knew that if they could somehow pull Ukraine away from Russia's orbit, then Russia would not be able to ever again really be a major player, at least, as they say, a Eurasian force. So they began plotting from that point on to do so. In the early 2000s, and then for quite a few years there, the U.S. was putting a lot of money into Ukraine, the $5 billion in total. The National Endowment for the Humanities and the head of the National Endowment for the Humanities, Gershman, said that Ukraine is the big prize. That's the great prize that we're going after. So the thinking was that that as part of NATO expansion, remember back in 1990, when Gorbachev allowed the unification of Germany, he was promised by the Germans, West Germans, by the United States, by Bush and others, by Baker, that NATO would not expand one thumb's width to the east. Right from the very beginning, that same year, they were already planning NATO expansion. They didn't begin to implement that until 1999, but then with the expansions in 1999, the expansions in the early 2000s, the continued expansions, even under Obama, NATO has expanded now 13 countries to the east. In 2008, George Bush began to talk openly about expanding NATO to Ukraine and Georgia. The U.S. ambassador was called in to the Russian government offices, William Burns. And William Burns sent a memo, secret memo, private memo, back to Washington. The headline was, Niet means Niet, Russia's red lines on expansion. And they told him explicitly that expanding NATO to Ukraine and Georgia was beyond what Russia would tolerate. It was very, very clear. And Burns expressed that to Bush. Bush ignored it. And Bush still called for NATO expansion. The opposition to NATO expansion to Ukraine was led by France, Germany, but also Hungary and the Benelux countries also opposed NATO expansion. So they weren't able to pull it off, but they still talked about it and threatened to do so. And then when in 2013, and I think it was 2013, 2014, that the Ukraine uprising began, the Russians were really quite alarmed. They thought that this was part of the U.S. policy for uh, changing the geopolitics of the region. Uh, so in 20, but then you've got the U.S. neocons intervening. Victoria Nuland was there on the ground supporting the demonstrators as the uprising began in February of that year. And then when they have the recordings, when she was talking to the U.S. ambassador, saying that, you know, when if the EU didn't want to go along with this, she says, "Fuck the EU," you know, and then she says, "Yatsenyuk is our guy." So they're even picking who they want to replace Yanukovych there. Then they have the Maidan uprising, and then the coup. They had an agreement for early elections that was going to change the government and also to revert to the earlier constitution as the protesters wanted. What was happening there, to go back again, is that the West had negotiated an economic deal with Ukraine. And the goal, again, the Financial Times, this is probably worth finding and reading also. The Financial Times had an article that lays out exactly what was behind this. I'm not sure if I can find it here quickly enough, but it says basically that here it says, this is 2013, November 21st. The Financial Times says the agreement, a sweeping deal more than 6 years in the making, that would have liberalized trade and required Kiev to incorporate EU law into its domestic legal code, was seen by many EU leaders as the critical next step in a decades-long effort to spread their democratic values further into the former Soviet bloc, with the goal of anchoring Ukraine firmly in the West. Of course, Putin was not going to look very kindly upon that. Putin made a counteroffer to Ukraine, which was actually a sweeter deal, in which he said that Ukraine would be part of both economic blocs, both political blocs, and he offered to a huge loan to Ukraine and a one-third decrease in energy prices that they would be getting from Russia. So Yanukovych then goes with Putin's deal. Then there's the uprising. Now, it's interesting to look at the people who were protesting. Many of them were liberals who were attracted to the West because, in some ways, the West represented a much freer, more modern alternative to Russia. I mean, there were a lot of reformers who wanted to closer ties with the West. There were also neo-Nazis and right sector fascists and there was always that right-wing fascist element in Ukraine. So the Maidan uprising occurs. There's a lot of conflicting reports about who did the shooting. We know that a lot of people claim that the shooters, the snipers, were actually tied to the protesters. The dominant narrative in the West is no, they were tied to the Yanukovych government. So, but then there's the shooting. People are slain. Yanukovych is forced to flee in what is called a coup that's run by the United States and the neocons and Nuland and the State Department in Ukraine. And then things really start to change. Ben Rhodes, who was Obama's security advisor, has said some very interesting things. Let me read just that too. Ben Rhodes says the Maidan shifted a gear. Says after that, Putin went on the offensive. The gloves were off in a way to Putin. Ukraine was such a part of Russia that he took it as an assault on him. Then Rhodes, in his memoir, writes, Putin, I think, interpreted the protests that ousted the Ukrainian president as the Americans coming into Russia. He thought we were behind those protests. He drew no distinction between Ukraine and Russia. I'd sit in the Oval Office and listen to these endless conversations where Putin would steer everything back to his view that we had overthrown a democratically elected government in Yanukovych. He was going to punch back. That's when we started to see fake news, and we started to see the release of intercepted communications to suit Russia's political narratives. So all of that set the stage for what happened in our election. You cannot understand the Russian meddling in the 2016 elections without understanding the Russian response to Ukraine. It was all the same tools. It was information warfare, essentially, that they had developed in Ukraine, just set loose in the United States. This is so important because among those who explained this was the former U.S. ambassador, Matlock. In the United States now, Mike McFaul, Russian ambassador, is all over the news shows. They don't interview Matlock, the former ambassador. And Matlock has a totally different understanding of what was happening and why the Russians acted that way. Matlock says that after 9/11, Russia was the first country to reach out to the United States, that Russia wanted to improve relationship, that Putin was desperate to improve relations with the United States, that he allowed the United States to Russia helped them bring goods into Afghanistan, food and other things to help the Americans in Afghanistan. He says, but then the United States turned. And Matlock details what the United States did with the NATO expansion, then in 2003, with the invasion of Ukraine, then the overthrow of the government in Libya. And he goes down the line about all these things that look to the Russians as betrayals, as part of an American attempt to wrest Ukraine away from Russia, to weaken and undermine Russia. Then he talks about the Magnitsky Act and the sanctions, and he talks about how that looked from the Russian standpoint. And so, and that's a very, very important perspective for understanding what's happening now in Ukraine. Putin saw the U.S. policies as an attempt to divide Russia, to weaken Russia, to undermine Russia, and Putin decided he's going to do the same thing to the United States. And so when we talk in the United States about the Russian meddling, we're talking about these messages that are an attempt to divide the United States, to send Americans fighting against each other. You know, Putin recognizes how dangerous this is. And maybe, I don't know what Trump recognizes about anything, but the situation now in the United States is that Trump deserves to be impeached. Trump is the most corrupt president the United States has ever had. We should get him on the Emoluments Act, on his corrupt business dealings. We should get him on this bribe to Ukraine, which was a clear bribe. It's self-evident. As Ambassador Sondland said in the hearings, he said this was a quid pro quo. Of course it was a quid pro quo. Mulvaney, the chief of staff, says, of course it was a quid pro quo. A quid pro quo in this case means that Trump wanted to use American money and American policy in order to pursue his own corrupt interests. Of course, he should be thrown out of office. Anybody who believes in the Constitution would have to support the overthrow and Trump's impeachment. Well, Democrats are divided. We can't talk about all the Democrats as if they're a monolith. There are some Democrats who support Edward Snowden. There are some Democrats who thought that Obama's security policies in that regard were reprehensible. We know that between 1917, when the Espionage Act was passed, and 2009, when Obama took office, 3 people had been prosecuted for whistleblowing under the Espionage Act. The first one was my dear friend Daniel Ellsberg, who released the Pentagon Papers and faced 115 years in prison, the rest of a life sentence, basically, for trying to stop the Vietnam War. Then there were 2 more. Under Obama, 8 whistleblowers were charges were brought against 8 whistleblowers. So Obama who promised to be the most transparent president in history, was the least transparent president up to the time of Donald Trump. So that's a reprehensible track record. And many Democrats, the Hillary Clinton wing of the Democratic Party, was adamant about prosecuting Edward Snowden. Snowden was a heroic whistleblower. Snowden exposed the extent of illegal U.S. government surveillance of all American citizens. So Snowden did a tremendous service, which Eric Holder, the Attorney General under Obama, now acknowledges that Snowden did a real service, but Obama still was after Snowden. So at the Democrats' level of hypocrisy, yeah, I mean, clearly the Democrats many of them are hypocrites when it comes to the question of whistleblowers, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't defend this whistleblower. It means we should defend this whistleblower. And he did the right thing, and it was great that he came forward. But we talk about whistleblowing, the Republican and impeachment, the Republicans wanted to impeach Bill Clinton for lying about a blowjob, right? So there's a lot of kind of blowing going on here, a lot of blowing smoke and blowing other things as well. But whistleblowers need to be protected and encouraged to come forward. Well, I think that both parties are ill-advised in what they're saying and doing. I mean, the Republicans have become now corrupt, totally corrupt. There's no longer a real conservative voice in the Republican Party. I mean, an honest conservative voice. What you have now is a party totally dominated by a neo-fascist, racist, homophobic, misogynist clown, buffoon, and the Republican Party is doing his bidding. There used to be Republicans who had a range of views. Now there's nothing but an extreme right-wing zealot group. It's very, very sad. Basically, it's a corrupt criminal conspiracy now, the Republican Party. The Democrats, on the other hand, are in many ways corrupt themselves. And that's also very sad. There are some good Democrats. There are a progressive wing of the Democratic Party who still stands for something. But the establishment Democrats are not that far from the Republicans when it comes from foreign policy. And historically, that's often been the case, that there's been a bipartisan consensus on foreign policy. The Democrats and Republicans differ strongly on domestic policy, but very little on foreign policy. So for years, they all accepted the Cold War mindset. The Republicans were more hawkish, but the Democrats brought us Vietnam and other wars as well. So there's been that bipartisan consensus. What's going on now is that Trump, and you know how I feel about Trump, but in some ways, Trump, for whatever reason, said that he was opposed to the U.S. interventions and forever wars. Trump is a hawk. He's a militarist. He's created record military budgets. I mean, he's bombed Syria when Obama chose not to bomb Syria, and Trump's done it twice. Trump's doubled down on Libya and other things. His drone attacks are even higher than Obama's drone attacks. So don't give Trump credit for being a principled anti-militarist in any sense. Trump just thinks that our bases overseas and our interventions are giveaways. And now he wants South Korea to quadruple its payments to the United States and Japan to do the same thing for the bases that we have there. So for Trump, it's some weird kind of perverse transaction thinking. But still, sometimes he says the right thing. And he said that U.S. and Russia should be better friends. The world needs that. The U.S. and Russia, as we know, have 93% of the world's nuclear weapons between us, including 1,800 on hair trigger alert. We better become friends if we want this planet to have a future. But that is not to say that Trump has good views on any of this, really. But what is going on now with the Democrats, as you mentioned, Obama refused to give lethal aid to Ukraine. Obama said explicitly that that lethal aid would end up doing two things. One, it would exacerbate the crisis there, prolong the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, undermine the Minsk agreement, the Minsk II agreement, which was the basis for settling things in Ukraine, which should happen, and we should get back to that. Uh, but he said, but this is going to just exacerbate the conflict and fuel the conflict. The javelins and the sniper rifles that we want, that other people wanted the U.S. to send. Uh, Obama opposed it. Trump supported it. Trump started to give lethal aid to Ukraine. I think it was December 2017 when he announced that he was going to give lethal aid to Ukraine. Obama was right and Trump was wrong on this. And the conflict has not dissipated. It's still ongoing and needs to be resolved. But the Democrats now, all the people who've been testifying are anti-Russia hawks. All of them want to double down on lethal aid to Ukraine. And the bizarre thing about this, the irony, is they're criticizing Trump for withholding the lethal aid. And still, that is a ground for impeachment, not because Trump is doing that, but because he's doing it because of corrupt personal reasons and political gain. But taking it out of that context, I think we should stop the lethal aid to Ukraine. We should pressure Ukraine to sit down with Putin, which is exactly what Zelensky wants to do. And Zelensky's biggest backer, this oligarch who was behind him from the beginning, who I think owned the television stations that he became a TV star on, has recently said that the U.S. can't be trusted, and that Russia should, that the Ukraine should again start talking to Russia and move closer to Russia again. Zelensky has indicated that he wants to do so. If the U.S. would get out of the way, maybe there could be a settlement. The other argument is that by withholding the aid to Ukraine, that we're undermining Zelensky's negotiating leverage. I'm not an expert enough to know if that's true or not. The United States could still show its support for Zelensky, support for Ukraine, and we can begin to get back to the kind of settlement and agreement that Putin had proposed from the beginning, so that Ukraine does not have to be just in the NATO camp, in the Western camp, in the EU camp, but Ukraine should have economic relations and friendly relations with both sides. There is a right-wing element in Ukraine, just as there's this right-wing element in the State Department and the U.S. government that would hate to see that happen. But I think anybody who really cares about the Ukrainian people would love to see that happen.